Welcome to the second in a series of conversations on race and social justice featuring members of the Georgia State University faculty. This program is sponsored by the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora and Georgia State University Library. I'm Audrey Goodman. I'm a professor in the English department at Georgia State, and it's really a pleasure today to introduce and to direct and listen in on the conversation that we'll be having with two of my brilliant colleagues, Gina Kaysen and Tiffany King. Their recent publications, I think, can help us reflect on our current moment where social justice is at the forefront of our thoughts and our actions. So I want to start out by introducing Gina Kaysen. She's an associate professor of English at Georgia State, where she teaches courses in American literature, Southern literature, Native American literatures, and documentary practices. In the spring of 2020, she began her term as president for Society for the Study of Southern Literature. And during the 2020-2021 academic year, she's going to be a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Budapest. The book she'll be discussing today, Red States, Indigeneity, Settler Colonialism, and Southern Studies, was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2018, and it won the 2019 Hugh Holman Award for the Best Book in Southern Literary Studies. She's also the co-editor of Small Screen Souths, Region, Identity, and the Cultural Politics of Television, published by LSU Press in 2017. In addition to these projects, Dr. Kaysen's work has appeared in many academic journals, and she has been a short-term research fellow at the American Antiquarian Society and the Southern Historical Collection. She's participated in NEH-sponsored programs at the Newberry Library, UNC Chapel Hill's American Indian Center, and Georgia College and State University's Flannery O'Connor Collection. From 2016 to 2019, she worked as the creator, co-producer, and host of the weekly podcast About South. So let's say hello to Gina. How are you doing today? So glad to have you.
Hi, Audrey. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to the Center for hosting this conversation. It's going to be a delight to talk to both you and Dr. King today.
Now, I would like to introduce our second participant in the conversation, Tiffany Lethabo King, an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Georgia State. The book she'll be discussing today is called The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, published by Duke University Press in 2019. This is a book that theorizes Black studies and Black thought as an offshore formation or a shoal that interrupts humanist traditions and impulses within the field of settler colonial studies. Dr. King has also edited an anthology titled Otherwise Worlds Against Settler Colonialism and Anti-Black Racism, published by Duke University Press this year. And this is a collection of essays that attend carefully to alternate kinds of relationships between Black and Native communities that can lead towards liberation. And in so doing, these are essays that point towards the importance of Black and Indigenous conversations for formulating otherwise worlds. It's really a pleasure to have Tiffany with us too. So give her a chance to say hello, and then we will start our conversation.
Hi, Audrey. Thank you for that introduction. Hi, Gina.
Great. So I'd like to start by asking both of you to talk about your titles and how you arrived at them. I think both of you write against the kind of simple oppositions that have structured thinking about race, indigeneity in the South. And, some of those oppositions, I think our listeners will be familiar with, Black, white, Native, not Native, lost, recovered, to name just a few. And both of your books do really complex and interesting work pushing against and analyzing and providing alternatives to these kinds of oppositions. And yet, really impressively, they both have these clear, resonant, multivalent titles. So maybe I'll invite whoever would like to answer first to talk about the title, the work that it does, and maybe the story of how you arrived at the title that's currently on your books. And maybe I'll just show, we've got one book here, try to get the right angle, and then Gina's book, Red States, right here. So you can see even in the design of the books, the kind of clarity and force of the title and its conception.
Okay, I'll go. That's a great question. And I like discussing it when I present about the books. Thank you for that. I was actually driving down Flat Shoals Avenue, or Flat Shoals Road, which is a road that leads to my own home in East Atlanta. And I was, I guess, in that kind of down space where a lot of your creative and critical thinking kind of comes into your mind when you're not dealing with your work. But in the background, I was really struggling at that particular point to come up with an organizing metaphor where I could think indigeneity and Blackness at the same time. And when I was writing about the shore or the shoreline, and I wasn't satisfied with it because shorelines are things that can often be incorporated into nation states or territories. And I wanted something that kind of busted up the confinement of the nation, right? And I didn't think that a shore did that, right? Because the shores can often be marked as territory. And I just happened to be, I guess, more sensitive to the geography around me in that time when I was kind of searching on a probably subconscious level for something else on the shore. And I said to myself, what's a shoal? Because it had never occurred to me to look it up. I wasn't even familiar with that nautical term. And so then when I went home and looked it up and found out that it was a place where I guess it could be described in two ways, like a shallow place in the ocean or a place where the ocean floor rises up and kind of breaks through the surface of water. And so it's a meeting place kind of between terra and ocean, or land and ocean. I was like, this is perfect. This is the perfect metaphor for the kind of meeting space that I want this book to attend to, because I find that often an organizing metaphor or a primary metaphor for indigeneity is terra or land, and a primary metaphor for Black diasporan life is the ocean. And I wanted to break up that binary, and the shoal did that wonderfully in a way that got me away from the territorial nation state boundedness of a shoreline. So that's where my the title comes from.
I like talking about this too, because the title really, Emily Bloom, who was a colleague that we had here in English at Georgia State, is the one who encouraged me toward the title. Red State was initially the title of the coda that I was imagining at the end. And Emily said, I really think this whole book is about this concept of the red state and how, particularly for white Southerners, this red state gets used as a shorthand to describe this space with no recognition of the history of Indigenous land and history, identity that continues to exist in the region, that has existed, since time immemorial in the region. And the way that there is, particularly among white Southerners, a romance of that history without any real engagement of what it means. And also then the book had always kind of been talking about these states of being, and what constitutes a nation state. And so the more I said the words out loud, the more it became clear that this really was a book about trying to take the conversations in Indigenous studies and the history of thinkers around the Red Power movement and Vine Deloria with something that I've described the book in other places as a very strongly worded love letter to Southern studies, because there truly is a dearth of any discussion of settler colonialism in that field. And for me, probably the book's most, maybe needed potential audience are white Southerners and white academics who study the South, who were absolutely not engaging with settler colonialism. And so maybe it's a bit of a cheeky title, and it's definitely a title that my mother worried was going to, she's always worried I'm going to finally get in trouble. And which maybe now I did it just now by saying that. But I think it was something that, let's take something that gets used as a shorthand and pause and ask, what does this really mean in all of its iteration?
I think one of the things that both titles really do is to encourage readers to think about space and scales of space. And I love Tiffany's account of discovering the formation of a shoal, which crops up in so many places. And in her book, she talks about how the shoal is this place of disruption, but kind of unpredictable disruption, just as in the rhythm of daily life and working life, one doesn't necessarily expect to find the answer to a really difficult problem, or rather the means to figure further thought about that problem. And so I think what both titles really do so richly is to encourage thinking about different scales of space and time, different figurations of space. So in Gina's case, the red states, maybe conjures for readers initially a map that is very graphic, that is very clearly delineated, but then the work of the book itself is to identify lots of different locations and different scales of locations. So I might invite you to think about, to talk a little bit more about the significance of different kinds of Southern spaces in your work, and how those spaces are figured, how they're figured, in maps. Both of you do really wonderful work with maps, and also how they're figured in stories. So thinking about Southern spaces in their multiple and multi-scalar forms might be something that you could talk about and give maybe a specific example from the work that you do in the book to give listeners a sense of how you approach space, how you work with it.
It's interesting. I like this question because I often think, even though I realize the book is so spatially oriented, one of the things that I always thought about it is it's really an argument about temporality. We say the South when we mean the U.S. South, which is, a shorthand that isn't satisfactory. And the U.S. South has not always existed. We have no reason to believe it is always going to exist. It's a temporality, right? It's a period as much as it is a space. And it's a period that dispossesses Indigenous people in a particular space and kidnaps Indigenous people from another space, and then attempts to build an exploitative economy based upon dislocation and kidnapping. And so we have a meeting of indigeneity that, while it's yielded a lot of amazing, cultural intersections, is rooted in the most exploitative, violent thing that it could be rooted in. And And I believe firmly in, yes, there's the global South, there's the US South, we might talk about the native South, we can talk about all these iterations, but I think we need to talk about it as a temporally bounded phenomenon because it's not that old. And there is absolutely no reason to think it always has to exist forever, right? It is a region invented around dispossession and exploitation. And so it's interesting for me to think about where this happens spatially in the world when you see these factors of land dispossession and kidnapping and enslavement. But for me, it's like, why do we have to imagine that this is always going to exist in these spaces? Like, there's got to be some room for a future here. And so for me, I don't think it comes across in the book totally at all. But I think it's such a spatial book, but in my mind, it's always been about temporality and period.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it was just wonderful, Gina, to hear you talk about your book. I haven't been able to pick it up yet, but it's hitting all of my love spots and sweet spots, particularly as someone who's interested in critical geographies and space. So I can't wait to read it. I don't necessarily take up the South per se. It's not a key word in my text, but I do look at a map, as an 18th century map, specifically a 1757 map, rendered by the cartographer William Gerard de Bram, right, who becomes an English settler in what we know as Georgia, also spent some time in Charleston, and was a military surveyor, someone who was helping the white militia certainly contain and kill the Cherokee and the Catawba in the area. Also was helping slave owners plot their territory, manage their property, which included Black slaves, and also wanted to create a geographic representation of that project of conquest and settlement, right? So had a particular imagined and invented construction of what Blackness and indigeneity should be in the 18th century. Largely for indigeneity, it was without space, without representation or anaspace, and for Black folks, it was fungible bodies that stood in for symbols of growth and fecundity and promise for the British colonies, right? But I think about across scales how to track projects of conquest and settlement, and particularly where Black and Indigenous folks were rebelling against that particular order of conquest. So then, of course, I have to look at the Caribbean, right? And I look at the Caribbean Basin, and particularly the 15th century and Columbus's landing as a site that really sets the stage for what I call a conquistador humanism that even informs life in what we now know as Canada. And so then I look at the space of Toronto, and particularly the artwork of a Jamaican Canadian artist, Charmaine Lurch, who refigures Sycorax as a fully Indigenous and fully Black figure in a sculpture in the space of Toronto, which I argue kind of flips the map and resituates the South, or the global South, and the scene of conquest in Canada. So I'm trying to remap the hemisphere through multiple scales, right? Through a figure of Sycorax linked to particular forms of conquest, European conquest, thinking about the conquest of Blackness and indigeneity, also Black and Indigenous rebellions in the Caribbean, in what we now know as the US South, and then how that helps us remap what we know as Canada and North America.
I think, Tiffany, your work with the kinds of public sites, the statues, the symbolic figures, and the reactions to them, beginning in your first chapter talking about the defacement of the statue of Columbus on the waterfront in Boston, and then ending with your analysis of the the statue of Sycorax in Toronto really speak to the issue of how these histories are resisted and renegotiated in public spaces, and obviously resonates so much with the recent protests from this past summer. And I'm interested in how what kind of response you've received to your analysis of those two critical moments, but they're so far from singular. And so just if you wanted to address the kind of ongoing dynamic of resistance that is played out in those public spaces in those chapters, and how you've been looking at recent events with all of the knowledge that you bring to the two episodes that you analyze.
Mm. No, that's a wonderful question. I know in June on Twitter, I was made aware that that same Columbus statue on the Boston waterfront was beheaded again, right? So on June 10th, it was beheaded, but it had been beheaded before by Indigenous activists, like on the eve of Columbus Day in 2006, right? And after that, as I described in 2015, allegedly Black Lives Matter activists tag the statue and throw red paint on it to simulate blood. But thinking about temporality, I'm glad that Gina brought that up. Thinking about these uprisings and the current rebellions that are publicly contesting space and public memory about who counts, right? And in fact, who is human. And that is definitely a cenotaph for a particular kind of humanity that requires Black and Indigenous death, like the direct assault on the landscape that writes Blackness and indigeneity as death bound is really powerful. And so I think seeing the ongoing felling and destruction of these monuments is probably kind of the best, not even a response to my chapter, but it resonates so well with them. And it just also lets us know just the fact that that particular statue has been hit time and time again. It also helps us rethink the frame of this current rebellion as something that is reawakened or restirred, right, and resurfaces, but is unending and has been. These rebellions have been around since the advent of conquest in the 15th century and continue up until the present moment. Right?
I really like those remarks from Tiffany too, because something that interests me, and I talk about in the book, is this the idea of a sporadic temporality, that things come around again, and these narratives, for better or for worse, right? Narratives get reused. Resistance models reawaken. It's always ongoing, and I think it's really being aware of that not only helps us recognize when narratives are getting reused in ways that are upholding white supremacy, it also helps people imagine resistance models, because there can be a reawakening. And I love what she's talking about with Toronto and re-engagement, because particularly in Southern studies, and in American studies, there's this idea of, I hate to use the word quarantine, but there is the idea of quarantining these ideas to specific geographies, such as the South. And any look at Indigenous history, any look at African American history, this is not exceptional to the region. This is baked into every colonial nation state on the continent. And so I think, this conversation is one of those moments that makes you a little bit sad that you have so much in common with a colleague. And indeed, Tiffany and I always enjoy when we see each other, but it's like, oh, we really need to talk to each other more, because we have such, I think, profound connection in the way we're thinking about these spaces and times.
Yeah, that configuration of sporullic temporality as in spiral. Yeah, I love that. I need to teach that. So I need to read your book immediately. Yeah.
Yeah, I really love the way that in both of your books, you are arguing against looking at singular events, saying this happened and it's done. This one act of rebellion, this one line, this one shore is a defining feature. You know, both of you are always opening up, in Tiffany's case, working with figures of the body, with images such as the really striking image you work with so richly from Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust, of the black hand stained with indigo from working on an indigo plantation. And you know, I started out asking and kind of thinking about locations, not so much about regional locations, but the way that each of you works with very specific places. And so, um, Tiffany, your work with the indigo processing plantation, your visit, the way that the image of the hand stuck with you and then led you to a place and to a history that, as you describe it, it's sort of at the edges of the plantation economy. And so those locations are so nuanced and so important to think about as counters to what you're both talking about as this kind of, you know, static and false narrative and false geography. So I wondered if maybe following up on that, Tiffany, you could talk about the sources that really drove your thinking or allowed your thinking to develop for this book. You spoke about the map, which is in Davidson College, and which you render in detail and take apart and use so fully. What other materials have been important to your, did you discover in the process of your research, and what what surprised you about your research? How did the discoveries of either, you know, films, literary texts, maps, objects, plays, how did all of these materials help to advance your thinking and contribute to the books as they've come to be?
Yeah, no. I had been traveling with Julie Dash for a while. Like I became aware of the film in the late 90s before I was even thinking about graduate school or becoming an academic, but then re-encountered the film, so viewed it again through a different lens when I was in an American Studies department as a graduate student, so I could bring a different kind of attention to it. And at that time, I'd already become committed to thinking through, at the time, settler colonial studies and Native feminisms to help me think about how to also resituate Black life and slavery, right? How to discover new things about slavery if I thought about settler colonialism and genocide. And so then I had a different eye when I looked at that film and I could pay attention to different things. The hands had never been so striking before I took that particular lens, right? And so I traveled with that as a dissertation project, then didn't actually encounter the map until like I was revising the final draft, so I couldn't fit it in the dissertation. I knew I had to include it in the book. So then just working with the map created another layer of analysis and nuance for how I could even think about the film and how I could use the film, particularly the cartouche, which details an indigo processing scene with scenes of indigo processing with the film and kind of meld them together and like think about how they interacted with one another. I had the opportunity to do that with this project in its book iteration. And then I had a new opportunity to think with Julie Dash's novel, of course, and think about all the different conversations I had witnessed about both the film and the book is a cultural production, I also had the opportunity to attend the 20th anniversary of the film and considered that as a site that I could bring into thinking about Julie Dash's imagination about Black and Indigenous relations, right? But the thing that did surprise me and I hadn't intended on was the encounter with Charmaine Lurch. Charmaine Lurch, when I met her in 2015, was taking the class of colleagues, Jen Harita Warren's class at York in the Environmental Studies Department. And Jen assigned my dissertation to my horror. I was like, I can't believe people are looking at it with all of the errors and the mess. But Charmaine actually reinterpreted the dissertation with her partner, Mosa Neely, as a two-woman play. And I was like, oh, I have to follow you. Like, we have to be in conversation. And I want to take what you do seriously as a multidisciplinary artist who like deals with a lot of the theoretical texts that I work with, is a serious Caribbean studies scholar. So she closely attends to the work of Sylvia Wynter, but then interprets it in the form of aesthetics and painting and sculpture. So that was a complete gift that I was able to run into Charmaine and develop that relationship. So it's surprising and wonderful turn my sources took.
Gino, do you want to share with our listeners some of either your research discoveries or maybe a path, a kind of unexpected path that your research took, because your book too brings together, such a wide range of materials, and you're interested in performance, you're interested in music, you're interested in literature, in politics. So, wrestling all those materials into book form, I know is really challenging. And I think, listeners might be interested to get a glimpse into your research process and how you manage those materials.
Well, I will say, because I do talk a lot about the outdoor dramas, of which the big one is The Lost Colony on the Outer Banks. And I have read the introduction to Tiffany's book, and the Outer Banks are essentially shoals. And it's one of those things, you read it after your book comes out and you think, oh my God, I wish I had this. Like, that is the language I needed to talk about what happens in the Outer Banks and why it's such a powerful space to think about these sites of indigeneity. I think that what surprised me about putting together the project is how many, I think, like, real people I got to talk to. And I like Tiffany's talking about, to the horror of someone reading your dissertation, or you just think, oh God. But when I started writing about these outdoor dramas, even though indeed, like, a lot of them traffic in some really unfortunate interpretations of history from their original scripts, to talk to the people who are participating in them about what they see as the value and limitation of the form, or to talk to audience members. I made so many friends and family go with me to watch these performances, and just hearing the perspective of how, everyday people who aren't professors are engaging and consuming interpretations of history. I think that matters. Like, I really do think that these massive popular sites, and, in using the term sites broadly, such as these performances, I mean, more people are going to see The Lost Colony every summer than are ever going to read my book. That is true. And so if I'm ignoring the chance to think, what does this mean to the people on the ground? How are they understanding this? And how is it influencing their lived experience as someone living in a space largely determined by the economics of settler colonialism, what does that mean? And so when you ask my unexpected turns, a lot of them were really just in trying to get beyond sitting in a room by myself writing this book, because the world is big and everyone has the right to consume historical narrative, and they have the right to be able to talk to people about what it means and what its limitations and possibilities are. And I think it can be easy in the university to lose sight of those conversations.
So let me ask you first, Gina, what do you hope for those readers who do pick up your book, and I understand it's going to be released in paperback shortly, so it will be accessible. What do you hope readers take away from your book? The readers who, who follow you through your arguments and your examples. And I know they may not be as numerous as the ones who are sitting in the outdoor plays, but I'm interested in how you would like to engage your readers, what you hope a reader coming to your book, maybe not knowing so much about the materials that you're presenting to them, what you'd like them to take away.
I think it depends upon the reader. I think I've been really direct that though I have, as a non-native scholar, I have benefited immensely from my education and mentorship in Native studies departments and from Indigenous and Native scholars. I don't think that my book is going to tell a lot of people in Indigenous studies things they don't already know. I do think it's saying a lot of things in Southern studies that have not been said. I say at the end of the book, if even one non-native person in the South, after reading this, pauses to think about where they live, how they are every day of our lives, we like to imagine, that the Removal Act is something in the past. Well, that's not true until spaces return to Indigenous people. We are still living and participating in removal in our present day. And so if even one non-native person pauses to ask themselves in the space that they think of as like the South, what they actually mean when they say that word, and what are all the erasures that go into producing that concept, whether it's as something beloved or as something despised. I think it's really important to interrogate what we mean and who the concept of region is for. And the truth is, the concept of region has been used against people time and time again, and not for people. And when people try to claim it, it's when critics often want to say, well, it doesn't matter anymore. Well, no, you don't get to say that just because it's not mattering for you, right? And so I'm kind of going back to something I said earlier with like the idea of temporal boundedness. Like it's not to get rid of the concept, it's to ask people to pay even more granular attention to the concept of the South and how they're still participating in these logics of removal and enslavement, not necessarily the acts themselves, but the logic of the act. And that's what I hope people maybe just to pause, I'm not asking for you to just pause and ask ourselves what we're taking for granted.
Yeah, in response to that question, I definitely have an agenda when thinking about my academic audience. So certainly my book is an intervention in a sense into discussions about coloniality genocide, settler colonialism that primarily take shape within the field, the emerging field of settler colonial studies, right? And I think that that field in particular has crowded out the possibility for thinking Blackness and more specifically for thinking about Black studies as a possible site to think about Indigenous genocide and settler colonialism, right? It's often seen as like a strange place or a place that wouldn't even be considering that conversation. So I wanted to have, particularly the academic audience, take Black studies seriously as a critical site for thinking about settler colonialism, genocide, and indigeneity, right? So that's one particular aim of the book. But certainly for a more general audience, and my mother's reading it right now and has a lot of questions about why did you even get into this field? Why do you write like this? But is still struggling with it and taking something from it. And will definitely then have conversations with me about, oh, wow, I just saw, for instance, some Indigenous activists show up on the screen with a Black Lives Matter sign, right? So, in people's articulations of freedom and what they want the world to be, particularly if you pay attention to movements right now, there is a very robust and dynamic conversation happening between Indigenous folks committed to decolonization and Native sovereignty and Black folks committed to abolition, right? So if we want to think about the police, and I think the scholar, Dakota scholar Nick Estey said it best, like you need to think about the police as both emerging from white militia, right, in 17th, 18th century who were trying to kill Indigenous people and slave patrols, right? Those are the roots of the police that we're actually having a discussion about abolishing right now, right? They have long roots in the project of genocide and enslavement. So it's an ideal book to think with right now in this particular moment.
Agreed. And I think an ideal book, and along with Gina's book, to be reading on the date of this broadcast, which is Indigenous Peoples Day. So we might conclude by asking you to share your thoughts on how to recognize this day and how your books provide a perspective on a day that has long needed to be rethought and renamed, but the work of renaming is, of course, only the beginning.
On a basic level, I mean, acknowledge the space, know where you are. There's a wonderful app called Native Land. It's literally an app you can download on your phone. And once you put it in and put in either your zip code or the city of Atlanta, you'll get a map of the territory of the Muskogee Cree, right? And so it literally helps you kind of remap where you are to pay attention to the original stewards, right? And not just stewards of the land, but people who have more than a relationship of stewardship, like a particular kind of oneness or being possessed by this place, which is an ontology that we're very unfamiliar with. So, one, a renaming and a knowing where you are is absolutely critical. And I mean, Gina expressed it well, like, don't imagine this place is already settled and your place here is settled. We're going to have to do some adjusting to live with one another, right? And be flexible and open, which seems scary, but to the possibility of living differently, and living wonderfully, right?
I love that. Yes, it's not settled, and I love thinking about unsettlement is really important. And if someone from Georgia State is watching this, I think a great way to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day would be a concerted effort to hire Indigenous scholars at this university. I'm not Native. I'm grateful that I get to teach Indigenous literature classes in the department, but I have to practice a pedagogy of my own obsolescence. That is foundational, that there are going to be Indigenous scholars hired and supported by the university. And if someone is watching this and they would like to consider that for Indigenous Peoples Day, um, I think that's a good place to start. We desperately need it. Um, Someone mentioned to me offhandedly when I started here that we didn't have Indigenous students. Um, I knew that could not be true. That's just statistically impossible. And of course, when I teach, the first early Indigenous lit class that Audrey and I finally got Indigenous literature on the books in the English department, there were multiple Indigenous students in that class. And I know that Tiffany and I share students, and I love when people come in and say, oh, I took Dr. King's class and I've read this and this, and she told me about your class. And, there's a community of students, native and non-native, that need support at this university. And a great way to support them is to hire Indigenous scholars to help make this a robust area. It's not just the ethical thing to do. It's not just for, I think we throw around the idea of, oh, it's just social justice, as if that should be a just. It would benefit everyone here. It benefits everybody. It changes the way we all think and engage with our planet to think about indigeneity. And so whoever's listening, a great way to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day would be think about where our university can become more engaged with Indigenous scholars, students, communities.
Thanks so much, Gina, for that clear declaration of what's needed. And thank you, Tiffany, for all of your engagements, and both of you for your work, the time you took to share your ideas with our audience today. I know that those of you who are listening may have questions, and we hope we'll be able to take some questions from you. But I just want to say I'm so grateful to have been part of the conversation today, and to be colleagues with Tiffany and Gina. Looking forward to working together. And I hope that those of you listening will think about this conversation and join in for the next one, for the third conversation in this series. Thanks so much. So welcome back. We are now live with Tiffany King, who is present, and we have Gina Kaysen, present in spirit, but distant in person. Our gathering now does give us a chance to take some questions from those of you listening and to extend the conversation that we recorded earlier. So I'm going to see which questions have come in and share them with you. The first question looks like picks up on some of the issues that Gina was talking about with respect to settler colonialism and how critical that framework is for her book. And the question is, in studies of American culture and history, what is the significance of orienting the scholarship around the term settler colonialism? And why is the shift from imagining America not simply as colonial, but as settler colonial so important? So Gina addressed that to some extent in the conversation. And Tiffany, if you want to pick up from there and elaborate on why that framework has been at the center of your work.
No, that's a great question. Thank you for that question, whoever submitted it. I wish Gina were here. Hey, Gina, wherever you are. Certainly, settler colonialism is a frame that is incredibly important and distinct from colonialism, right? There are various forms of colonial power, like franchise colonialism, direct rule, indirect rule, where people primarily, for instance, in the Anglophone Caribbean, before the abolition of slavery were administratively ruling through a planter class, which was a minority kind of population in the Caribbean, right? And doing a kind of indirect rule where the colonizer wasn't necessarily there to stay and make a life on a landmass, right? And that is a different dynamic than in a settler colonial space like the US that Gina was talking about, the US and Canada that I'm talking about, where there is a settler presence that actually needs to constantly commit genocide and forms of elimination, elimination of peoples and non human life forms in order to instill a settler order like in the US, right? So the project of genocide against indigenous people is core to a settler colonial project, right? One of the things that I do, because I don't necessarily center settler colonialism, I center the analytic of conquest, because settler colonialism generally deals with a native settler binary that within multiracial formations and like multiracial states like the US, where there is a Black population and an indigenous population and a settler population and other migrant populations. I think within a settler colonial dyad of settler and indigenous, some of the people that you can't fit into the settler category or the indigenous category tend to get erased. So often people use a multiple frames. We'll have to use settler colonialism to talk about indigenous genocide and the theft of land, the control of land, and then when you want to incorporate Black people, there's I argue that there isn't a lot of room to do that in a settler colonial framework. So conquest, which might focus and take you to some other kinds of 15th, 16th century forms of conquistador violence that think about people like Columbus, for instance, who were both involved in the slave trade and the genocide of indigenous people and the theft of land, can bring in all of those kinds of forms of racial violence and the settlement of land as well. So settler colonialism has a distinct particular place and a kind of analytical work that it does that I think it was Natsu talked about a few weeks ago or last week, actually. But that's a great question.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think our next question is a kind of follow-up to that one, which is given your deep historical reach and your understanding of how settler colonialism has been a structure that has helped us to remap so many places in the Americas and to unsettle even the shoreline through your figuration. I think the follow up question is a question of applicability to our current moment. So the question is, how does your book and your work help students, especially undergraduate students who might not have access to the theoretical sophistication that you would bring to more advanced study? How would it help those students understand our current moment of racial unrest?
No, that's a great question. Specifically thinking about my own work, I know that my first substantive chapter deals with the contemporary moment. So it deals with the 2015 defacing of a statue. And so that Columbus statue was defaced in June, right? It was defaced not just defaced, it was beheaded in June. So in the middle of uprisings, in response to George Floyd's murder by the police and also Rayshard Brooks's murder by the police, these particular sites that we imagine as historical and representing historical forms of violence continue to be sites of interrogation and intervention for activists right now, right? So you have activists all over the world thinking about how the presence and the memorialization of slaveholders in Britain, even in Barbados right now, really continue to take up space in the imagination of people who are part of colonial, neo-colonial imperial governments and the current administration right now. I mean, the ways that um, particularly Trump took to the mic to make that statement from the White House in defense of Columbus Day today is something that you can reflect on and play in your classroom, right? It is definitely a moment to think about how are Indigenous people and their struggles for sovereignty and the return of their land issues that we need to take on. So it's something that you could discuss in a university classroom. So, for instance, Gina talked about the lack of presence of Indigenous and Native scholars at the university, right? So that is definitely something that students can rally around, and students who are putting pressure on the administration around diversity and inclusion could think about. Students are also thinking about the ways that buildings are named on a university campus, right? So again, thinking about the fact that Georgia State is on Muskogee Creek, ancestral homeland is something to think about when they're reimagining how to remap and name and give their university identity, right? So these are issues that are, yes, historical, but contemporary and meaningful in the present moment and meaningful in the classroom too.
Absolutely. And I think there are so many opportunities for students to not only engage with your work, but see how the academic, theoretical, historical, and literary questions that you and Gina both engage in your work resonate in their everyday lives. And I might pose a final question to you concerning how you got interested in academic study, because with your breadth of interest, surely you might have felt yourself pulled in different directions, or pulled towards activism, or pulled towards expression in different forms. So, if our listeners are students, they may want to hear about your academic path and how you became drawn to scholarship and the rewards of the work that you're doing, maybe also what lies ahead. So, one final complex question, which you could answer as you like. Thank you.
I think that I ended up doing academic work and becoming an academic in the way that a lot of burned out organizers do. Like, I'm meeting some graduate students who remind me of myself, like after 10 years of being an organizer and activist, particularly working in Philly around housing justice. And at that forum, at that time, not forum, at that time in the late 90s, still working on welfare rights issues when we knew welfare as TANF, just the burnout and being tired and dealing with some of the contradictions and the imperfections of the nonprofit industrial complex as its own workplace and site of violence and place of exploitation. People want to think about their work in a different way and maybe have some more flexibility to work on issues that are important to them and work with organizers, activists, cultural producers, communities in a different kind of way. So that was the way that I came into the academy, and it allows me to still have a relationship with people doing work on the ground. And hopefully, I've been doing a good job of using my resources here at the university to support that kind of on the ground organizing. So I'm meeting students in my particularly undergrad classes all the time who are doing both right now, who are part of Southerners on New Ground or SNAPCO, Solutions Not Punishment Collective, and are also in the undergraduate classroom thinking about these texts, and thinking about these texts is critical to some of the political education work that they do in their communities. So that's how I got here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, Dr. King, Dr. Kaysen in absentia, and thank you to all who tuned in, posed questions. I know that both of these wonderful scholars would be happy to engage in your questions outside of this forum. Their emails are accessible through the Georgia State departmental websites. And in addition, this is part of an ongoing set of conversations, and I very much hope that you will tune in for our next one. Thank you so much.